I never thought a weekend trip with Jason would become the start of something so complicated. We had discussed the idea for a long time: a weekend by the sea, a quiet little town with cozy cafes, the sound of waves on deserted beaches. It was supposed to be the perfect break from our routine lives. But when Jason suggested bringing his stepbrother Nicholas along, I felt a strange, barely noticeable tension. "Would you mind? He's been wanting to spend time with us for a while," Jason said, looking at me with those warm eyes that always held a spark of hope. "Of course not," I replied with a smile, though a vague unease stirred within me. We met Nicholas at the station. Tall, with slightly tousled hair, he looked like he had just stepped out of a movie. His slight smile and confident gaze immediately caught my attention. "So you're the famous Allison," he said, extending his hand. His voice was low, with a hint of raspiness, and it felt as though every word he spoke carried a special meaning. "And you must be Nicholas." I responded as casually as I could, though I noticed my fingers lingered in his hand a moment longer than they should have. In the car, he sat in the back, giving Jason and me space to be together. But I found myself constantly tuning into his comments, laced with irony and a certain charm. His laughter was infectious, his observations sharp. It was an odd contrast to Jason's caring, but sometimes predictable demeanor. When we arrived at the hotel, the first complications arose. At the reception desk, we were greeted by a young woman with a visibly tired expression. "I'm sorry, but there's been an issue with your booking. We only have one double room and one single room left," she said, looking at us apologetically. Jason quickly resolved the situation, suggesting he take the single room. "I sleep soundly anyway, so it's no big deal. Allison, you can stay with Nicholas. I'm sure he doesn't snore," he joked, giving me an encouraging smile. My own smile felt strained. "Of course, no problem," I replied, though my heart began to beat faster. When we entered the room, the air felt heavy. It was tiny: one large bed, a small table, and a window overlooking the parking lot. Nicholas placed his backpack in the corner and looked around. "Well, here's our humble little corner. I hope I'm not too bad a roommate." "Everything's fine," I said, though I felt like I was on edge. That night, I tossed and turned, listening to his breathing nearby. Nicholas lay on the edge of the bed, leaving me as much space as possible, but it didn't help. It felt as though his presence filled the entire room, each breath echoing in my chest. "I can't believe Jason left us alone so easily," he finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low and almost intimate in the stillness of the night. "What's so strange about that?" I replied, trying to sound calm, though I could feel my cheeks flush. "Just interesting how much he trusts you." His words felt like a challenge. I didn't know how to respond, so I turned over to face the other way. But something inside me had already shifted. The night fell quickly. Through the window of our room, the lights of passing cars flickered, their reflections trembling faintly on the walls. Jason had gone to his room, leaving me alone with Nicholas. I tried to appear composed, but inside, everything was in turmoil. Standing before the bathroom mirror, I debated over what to wear to bed. My backpack held the usual cotton pajamas I always packed for trips, but tonight, I chose something else. A soft pink tank top with thin straps and shorts, comfortable enough, but undeniably revealing my figure. I justified the choice with the heat, though deep down, I knew that wasn't the only reason. When I returned to the room, Nicholas was lying on the bed, his arms behind his head. His shirt had ridden up slightly, exposing a sliver of skin on his stomach. He glanced at me, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Not bad," he remarked, nodding toward my outfit. "What?" I pretended not to understand. "You look ready for this little sleepover with the brother." "You're not my brother, Nicholas," I snapped, feeling heat rise within me. "True," he said, propping himself up on one elbow, his voice softening. Still, don't you find it strange? Sharing a bed with your boyfriend's brother? I turned away, feigning distraction, though in reality, the tension coursing through my body was impossible to ignore. You can sleep on the other side if you're so uncomfortable, I said, attempting to regain control of the situation. Don't worry, I don't bite, he replied, his voice calm but laced with irony. Lying on my side of the bed, I stared at the ceiling. Every sound felt amplified. I could feel the warmth of his body, even though a respectable distance separated us. Nicholas joked about how absurd the situation was, but I found it hard to focus on his words. Are you always this tense? He suddenly asked. Tense? I turned to face him. No, this is a bit awkward, that's all. Awkward or interesting? He replied with a faint smile, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. I tried to turn away, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. And what's so interesting? Well, for one, he said, his gaze piercing, watching you make everything so complicated. His words made my cheeks flush. I should have ended the conversation, but instead, I shot back. And you? You seem to simplify everything, don't you? Maybe, but not with you, Allison. With you, it's impossible. His response caught me off guard. I knew I should have stopped this exchange, but something held me back. The atmosphere between us grew heavier. Nicholas shifted slightly closer, though he stayed on his side of the bed. You're too serious, he murmured, his voice low and almost silky. It gets in the way sometimes. And you're too confident, I countered, though my tone lacked any real anger. He smirked and leaned in slightly. I didn't know what would happen in the next second, but I couldn't look away. Nicholas moved closer, and our lips met. It was a fleeting, almost tentative kiss, but it left me feeling as though my world had turned upside down. At that moment, the phone on the nightstand chimed with a message. We both froze. It was Jason. Checking up on you, Nicholas remarked with a smirk. I got out of bed, trying to calm the wave of guilt that washed over me. My fingers trembled as I unlocked the phone. Jason had simply wished me good night. I turned back to Nicholas. He had already settled back down, his expression serene, but I knew he felt the same tension I did. I lay down and closed my eyes, but sleep eluded me. The longing to see his gaze, hear his voice, and feel him nearby only grew stronger. The night felt endless, and with every passing hour, I realized that fleeting kiss had become something far greater than I was ready to admit to myself. The morning began with bright sunlight streaming through the white curtains of the room. Jason, always energetic and ready for new adventures, suggested heading to the beach. I tried to muster some enthusiasm, though inwardly I felt drained. After the previous evening, all I wanted was to avoid any interaction with Nicholas. We got ready quickly. I chose a light white dress that seemed simple enough, but every flutter of its hem in the breeze caught attention. I consoled myself with the thought that it was just the morning and that everything from yesterday would stay in the past. Nicholas acted as if nothing had happened, occasionally glancing at me. It irritated and intrigued me at the same time. The beach was perfect, soft sand, the sound of waves, and a few scattered sunbathers. Jason immediately pulled out his camera and began filming everything around him, fully absorbed in the process. This gave me an opportunity to stay on the sidelines, but to my horror, it also left me alone with Nicholas. Are you always this quiet in the morning? Nicholas stood nearby, his tone casual, but with a hint of challenge. Just enjoying the view, I replied without turning around. Do you think he's filming you? Nicholas nodded toward Jason, who was now lying on his stomach, trying to find the best angle. Why do you ask? I'm just curious how people see you. You know, you're completely different when you're not trying to be perfect. His words struck me like a subtle jab. I forced myself not to respond, but my body betrayed me. My hands nervously fiddled with the hem of my dress, and my gaze couldn't meet his. Are you still mad about last night? He asked, stepping slightly closer. I'm not mad because it doesn't mean anything. I shot back quickly, but my voice sounded too sharp. Doesn't mean anything? He raised an eyebrow and laughed. That laugh, low, light, almost apologetic, made me blush. Exactly. It was a foolish moment. Let's just forget about it, okay? Do you really want to forget? His voice held no pressure, only a gentle irony that made it impossible to escape the topic. Yes. He leaned in just enough for me to catch the scent of his cologne and said almost in a whisper, Then why have you been avoiding me all day? I froze. His words were too precise to ignore. It was true. Every move he made, every glance, even his mere presence, made me feel uneasy. I knew I should keep my distance, but something inside me pulled toward him. Stop it, Nicholas. I tried to maintain my composure. All right, he stepped back, once again becoming that easygoing and calm person, but his gaze spoke volumes. Jason, finally done photographing another rock, came up to us. Guys, you have to see this. I found an amazing spot for pictures. His voice brimming with enthusiasm as usual. He grabbed my hand, leading me away. As we walked, I could feel Nicholas trailing behind us. His shadow seemed to follow me, reminding me of everything I was trying to forget. But instead of relief, I felt a growing sense of uncertainty and strange excitement. We stopped at a large rock, washed by the waves. Jason dove back into his camera work, completely engrossed in his craft. Nicholas stayed by my side, this time not trying to strike up a conversation. I clasped my hands together, feeling my resolve weaken with every passing moment. You know, I don't forget things that easily either, he said at last. His voice was soft, but carried a clear note of defiance. I looked at him, searching for words, but they were stuck somewhere deep inside. He stood too close, too confident. Aren't you even a little curious about what could have been? He continued. It doesn't matter. I felt my words losing their strength. It matters if you're thinking about it. His words sounded like a truth I didn't want to admit. But something within me had already begun to crumble. In that moment, as Jason once again disappeared into his creative zone, I realized that the battle between morality and desire was becoming harder to fight. Nicholas said nothing more, but his presence became unbearably vivid. After a long day, Jason fell asleep almost instantly as soon as his head hit the pillow. His steady breathing echoed softly in the stillness of the room. I sat by the window, gazing at the street illuminated by sparse streetlights. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the promise of something new. Nicholas entered the room quietly, as if not wanting to wake anyone, but his eyes immediately found mine. Do you want to go for a walk? He asked, holding a jacket in his hand. It's too stuffy in here. I could have said no. I had every reason to, but I found myself nodding. Give me a minute. I threw on a light cardigan, though the coolness of the evening breeze felt more inviting than something to shield against. We stepped outside, and I felt as though a weight I'd carried all day had been lifted, leaving my steps light and free. Do you often take walks like this in the evening? I asked, trying to diffuse the tension that seemed so palpable. Only when there's company worth doing it for, he replied, with that easy smile of his that managed to both irritate and enchant me. We strolled along the empty boardwalk. The wind tousled my hair, and each time it brushed against my face, my breath quickened. Nicholas walked beside me, his steps unhurried, but his presence exuding a quiet confidence. Are you always this on edge? He asked after a few minutes. I'm not on edge, I replied quickly, trying to sound calm. Really? Then why do you look like you're afraid of your own shadow? I stopped abruptly and turned to face him. Seriously? Do you think it's appropriate to ask questions like that? I think it's honest, he said, taking a step closer. The faint glow of a nearby street lamp illuminated his face. We stood on the pier, which felt like it was separated from the rest of the world. In the distance, the soft rhythm of waves played, as if the sea itself was reminding us of its eternal presence. Tell me, Allison, his voice lowered, the tension in it only growing sharper. Do you always try so hard to stay in control? Why does it matter to you? Because you look like you want to run, but can't. His words hit harder than I expected. I felt my fingers instinctively fidget with the edge of my cardigan. You don't know anything about me, Nicholas. Maybe, but I know how you feel right now. Do you? My voice wavered as I replied. And what's that? You're fighting with yourself. My voice trembled as I answered. Maybe you're just too full of yourself. Maybe, but you haven't walked away. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken truths. I felt his eyes on mine, piercing and sure, yet carrying an inexplicable pain. We stood there until the silence became unbearable. Slowly, he reached out and brushed his fingers against mine. It was such a subtle gesture, but it sent a shiver through me. You should stop, I whispered, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. Say that again, he murmured, his voice soft but laced with a challenge. I didn't say it again. Instead, I felt him lean closer. I don't know who moved first, but in the next moment, his lips were on mine again. This kiss was different, longer, more deliberate, as if it spoke the words we were too afraid to voice. I felt my hands tremble as I pulled back slightly. This is wrong, Nicholas. Maybe, he said, but his eyes stayed locked on mine, searching for something unspoken. I stepped back, feeling the intertwining of guilt and desire surge within me, overwhelming and undeniable. I need to go back, I said, more to myself than to him. He didn't reply, but his silence spoke louder than any words could. I turned and began walking back to the hotel, feeling his gaze linger on my back. Every step was an effort, a battle against the part of me that wanted to stay right there on the pier. The morning began with a familiar ritual. Breakfast, the hum of conversation in the hotel restaurant, and Jason's casual jokes. Yet something inside me had shifted. I found myself noticing every detail, the way Nicholas pulled out a chair, the flicker of his hand in my peripheral vision, the timbre of his voice amid the general chatter. Even when I focused on my coffee, trying to avoid looking his way, it felt as though he was still there. His presence electric, leaving me charged like a live wire. Nicholas was calm, but his calmness was deliberate, almost theatrical. He skillfully deflected Jason's attention, but when our eyes met, the air between us seemed to thicken. It was a silent language, one that needed no words. I wasn't sure if he could read my thoughts, but every movement of his felt intentional, directed straight at me. After breakfast, Jason left to pursue his own plans, something about photography and local landmarks. I stayed in the lobby, pretending to read a magazine, though the words blurred before my eyes. Nicholas approached, careful not to intrude on my personal space, yet his presence was impossible to ignore. Still can't relax? He asked softly, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. I have no reason to be tense, I replied, not lifting my gaze. Really? He leaned in slightly, and I caught a faint trace of his cologne. Then why can't you look at me? I froze. His words were too precise, too disarming. I raised my eyes, and when our gazes met, it lasted only a moment, but it felt like drowning in his stare. You're imagining things, Nicholas, I said, striving for confidence. Maybe, or maybe not. He smiled faintly and stepped back, as if content to leave me with those words. All day I tried to act normal, but every little thing betrayed me. When Nicholas accidentally brushed my hand while passing a plate at lunch, I flinched as if I'd been shocked. His fingers lingered just a fraction too long, enough to spark a storm of emotions inside me. Jason noticed nothing. He was too absorbed in his plans, enthusiastically suggesting dinner at a local restaurant. I watched him, guilt swelling in me. He was kind and attentive as always, but predictable. His attention felt like the comfort of a worn blanket. Warm, familiar, but lacking the edge I now craved. Nicholas was different. He didn't just attract me physically, it was a pull on a deeper level. I found myself wanting to be near him, to hear his voice, to catch his smiles. This desire was dangerous, and I knew it exceeded mere chemistry. That evening, the three of us went for a walk along the waterfront. Jason walked ahead, chatting about the sights, while I found myself next to Nicholas. We didn't speak, but the silence between us was more telling than any words. At one point, he glanced at me, his gaze steady, but laced with understanding. "Are you going to keep pretending nothing's happening?" he asked quietly. "Nothing is happening," I replied, not even trying to sound convincing. "Ellison, do you really believe that?" I didn't know how to answer. His confidence unsettled me, yet it also drew me in like a moth to a flame. I looked away, pretending to study the sea. "You're too sure of yourself, Nicholas," I said, trying to deflect. "No, I just see what's obvious." His words echoed in my mind, replaying again and again as I trailed behind Jason, the weight of my thoughts nearly unbearable. Desire and guilt warred within me, creating a chaos I couldn't escape. The last night at the hotel turned out to be unexpectedly quiet. Jason, as usual, was absorbed in his work, locked away in his room, completely engrossed in editing the photos he had taken that day. I was left alone in our shared room, doing my best to pretend I didn't mind. I turned on the TV, but even the muted voices on the screen couldn't distract me. Each minute stretched into an hour. Thoughts of the past few days, of glances, touches, and Nicholas's words, swirled in my mind like an old film I couldn't turn off. When I heard a knock at the door, my heart skipped a beat. "May I?" It was Nicholas. I opened the door, trying to appear calm. "Did something happen?" I asked, stepping back slightly. "I forgot my charger." His voice was too steady, too casual. He stepped inside, scanned the room, and headed to the desk where his charger actually lay. I stood by the window, feeling the silence between us grow heavier, like the stillness before a storm. When he turned to me, there was something in his eyes that I feared, an unyielding certainty. "You know, I thought you'd avoid me until the very end," he said, calmly wrapping the cord around his hand. "Nicholas, maybe you should just leave," I said, trying to sound cold, though my voice betrayed me. "Leave?" He took a step closer. "Why? So you can go back to convincing yourself you don't feel anything?" "This is wrong," I said, retreating toward the wall. "Is it?" He tilted his head, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "And what exactly is wrong? The fact that you're afraid to admit what you want?" I didn't know how to respond. His words were blunt, almost cruel, but they hit their mark. "Nicholas, stop." My words were weak, trembling like autumn leaves in the wind. "Stop?" He laughed, but there was nothing light about it. "You know what your problem is, Ellison? You want to control everything." "And yours?" I shot back, anger rising within me. "Yours is that you don't respect boundaries." "Maybe. But tell me this. Do you really want me to leave?" I fell silent. He took another step closer, and only inches separated us now. His gaze burned into me, erasing every argument I'd tried to convince myself of. "You can still say no," he murmured, his voice a quiet challenge. But I couldn't. My silence spoke louder than any words could. Nicholas reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my hand. The touch made me tremble. It was so gentle, almost innocent, yet it held everything I had been trying to suppress. My hand moved toward his of its own accord, as if there were a magnetic force between us. In the next moment, he leaned in, and our lips met again. This kiss was different. It wasn't fleeting or accidental. It was deep and charged, like a storm that had been building for days. His arms wrapped around my waist, pulling me closer, and I, forgetting everything, responded in kind. But then reality crashed into me like a cold wave. I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft but unmistakably real. "The door," I whispered, pulling back sharply, my voice barely audible. Nicholas turned toward the door. It was slightly ajar. My heart was pounding so loudly, I couldn't hear anything else. "It doesn't matter," he said quietly, but I could barely breathe. "Please, just go," I managed, trying to regain some semblance of control. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, slowly stepped out, and closed the door behind him. I stood alone in the room, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. Desire and guilt clashed within me, leaving only emptiness in their wake. I walked to the door and quietly turned the key in the lock, but even that couldn't close the door Nicholas and I had opened. I woke up earlier than usual. The morning sunlight seeped through the thin curtains, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. I lay motionless, listening to the silence of the room. Memories of the previous night hit me like an avalanche, and I couldn't stop them. Every detail, every word, every touch replayed in my mind over and over again. I pressed my hands to my face, as if that could drown out the noise of my thoughts. Guilt and an irresistible pull intertwined into a heavy, tangled knot. What am I doing? How did I get here? These questions swirled in my head, but no answers came. I knew I should have stopped, but I hadn't. Jason knocked on the door and peeked in, already fully dressed. "Good morning. How are you?" His voice was as warm and friendly as ever. "Great," I replied, trying to sound casual. I put on jeans and a simple t-shirt, glancing at myself in the mirror. My face looked fine, but I felt like a stranger to myself. "Pull yourself together," I commanded silently. "No one knows anything. Just act like everything is fine." When I came down to the restaurant, Nicholas was already sitting at a table with a cup of coffee. He looked completely calm, as if the night had been as uneventful for him as it might have been for any other hotel guest. "Finally!" he smiled, looking up. "I thought you all decided to sleep through breakfast." I sat across from him, avoiding his gaze. Jason joined us a few minutes later, brimming with energy and enthusiasm. "We've got a busy day ahead. Let's explore the area a bit more, and then head home this evening," he announced, pulling out a chair. "Sure," I said, trying to focus on my breakfast, but all I could feel was Nicholas's presence. Every time I glanced up, he was looking at me. Not openly, not provocatively, but just long enough for me to know he remembered. And every small gesture, how he poured himself coffee, how he adjusted his shirt sleeve, seemed laden with unspoken meaning. "You look tense, Allison," he suddenly remarked, his tone light and almost teasing, but there was a glint of something in his eyes. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," I answered quickly, gripping my fork harder than necessary. Jason noticed nothing. His mind was elsewhere, probably planning a new route or thinking about his next photo. This gave Nicholas and me too much room for a silent dialogue that needed no words. By lunch, Jason suggested stopping for a picnic. We found a secluded spot near the woods where we could spread out a blanket and relax. While Jason unpacked the food and checked his camera, I tried to keep myself busy, handing out water, untying bags. But when Nicholas stepped closer, my heart started pounding again. "Here," he said, handing me a glass of juice. His fingers barely brushed mine, but it was enough. That touch seemed to speak more than our kiss the night before. A jolt shot through me. I quickly pulled my hand back, as if burned, and looked into his eyes. He smiled silently, as though he knew exactly what I was feeling. "Have you seen my napkins?" Jason suddenly asked, oblivious to everything around him. "Of course, they're in the bag," Nicholas replied, with the same ease he'd maintained all day. I turned away, trying to steady my breathing. A conflict raged inside me. Part of me wanted to grab Nicholas's hand and beg him to stop, while the other wanted to stay close, ignoring everything else. This picnic wasn't a respite, it was a trial. By the time we returned to the hotel, I was drained. But something inside me knew. This day wouldn't mark the end of this struggle. Home had always seemed like a place where I could restore balance and return to my usual rhythm. But after this trip, I couldn't find myself. Everything around looked the same as before. The bright kitchen, the bookshelves, the armchair Jason loved to sit in during the evenings. Yet now I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living someone else's life. Every morning began the same way. I would get up, brew coffee, and make breakfast. But thoughts of Nicholas stayed with me constantly. His smile, his gaze, his touch. It felt as though I had brought part of his presence home with me, filling voids I hadn't even realized were there. Jason was as caring as ever. He joked, hugged me, and shared his plans for the coming weeks. But his touch lacked the electricity I had felt with Nicholas. I found myself comparing the two, even though I hated myself for it. One evening, while we were having dinner, Jason mentioned his brother. "Nicholas called," he said, putting down his fork. "He's inviting us over for dinner next weekend." My heart skipped a beat. Dinner? At his place? I tried to sound indifferent, but my voice wavered slightly. "Yeah, he said he hasn't hosted anything like this in a while and wants us to come." "That sounds great," I managed to say, lowering my eyes to my plate. I knew I shouldn't go. It was too dangerous, too obvious. But refusing would raise questions. And there was something else, a pull deep inside me, urging me to see Nicholas again. His home was just like him, stylish, yet unpretentious. The kitchen lights cast a warm glow, and the air was filled with the aroma of roasted meat and spices. Nicholas greeted us at the door in his usual relaxed manner, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm glad you could make it," he said, giving me a brief glance, in which I caught a familiar glimmer. Dinner started off uneventfully. Jason sat across from me, animatedly talking to Nicholas about his new projects. I tried not to look at Nicholas, but every time he spoke, his voice seemed to cut through everything, commanding my attention. "Allison," Nicholas said at one point, turning to me, "how did you enjoy our last weekend? I hope you managed to relax." His words were innocent on the surface, but I felt the weight beneath them. I tried to keep my composure. "Of course," I replied, meeting his gaze briefly before dropping my eyes to my glass of wine. "It was nice." "Nice?" He smirked, his smile almost mocking. "You're always so concise?" Jason didn't pick up on the subtext. He was scrolling through something on his phone, showing Nicholas photos. But I felt the tension building. Every time Nicholas spoke or even remained silent, the room seemed to grow heavier, more stifling. "You're remarkable, Allison," Nicholas said suddenly, looking directly at me. "You manage to stay so calm, even when there's so much going on around you." "It's called self-control," I replied, trying to sound confident, but there was a hint of defiance in my tone. "So you always keep everything under control?" His voice softened, but it remained insistent. "I try," I said, taking a sip of wine, aware of the faint trembling in my fingers. Jason laughed, oblivious to the unspoken dialogue. "That's true about Allison. She always knows what to do," he added, placing his hand over mine. I felt trapped. Two realities, the stability with Jason and the electric tension with Nicholas, were colliding inside me, threatening to shatter the fragile balance I was clinging to. When dinner ended and we prepared to leave, Nicholas walked us to the door. His goodbye was polite, but the moment Jason stepped ahead, Nicholas leaned in and whispered softly, "We'll see each other again." Those words haunted me all the way home. They weren't a promise, they were a certainty. And the most terrifying part was that I couldn't decide whether I wanted it to happen or feared it more than anything else. I sat for a long time in front of a blank sheet of paper, holding a pen in my hand. My fingers trembled, and a storm raged inside me. Writing a letter to Nicholas felt like both a liberation and madness. It was my way of dealing with what was happening. I knew I couldn't keep everything inside anymore, but saying it out loud was impossible. Each word came with difficulty. I started with the simplest. Nicholas, I can't ignore this anymore. What's happening between us is wrong, but I don't know how to handle it. You make me feel things I haven't felt in so long. It's terrifying and captivating at the same time. I don't want this to continue, but I can't let go of these feelings either. Maybe you can tell me how we should proceed? I read the words over and over. They seemed straightforward, yet tangled. The letter carried all my inner contradictions. Finally, I mustered the courage to send the message through the messenger, trying not to think about the consequences. The reply came faster than I expected. Nicholas didn't dodge the issue or hide anything. I feel the same. I can't deny it, no matter how hard I try. Maybe we should meet and talk. Without Jason, without any extra pressure. Just you and me. Let's just talk. I felt my fingers type a response almost on their own. Within minutes, we arranged to meet at a small cafe out of town. The place seemed safe and neutral, but I knew that in our situation, such a thing didn't truly exist. I arrived first and chose a table in the corner. My hands were cold as ice, and my heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear the music in the room. When Nicholas walked in, I noticed him immediately. He looked as if this was just a casual meeting, but his gaze said more than words. He sat across from me, his smile warm but restrained. "I knew you'd write," he said quietly, looking at me. "Why?" My voice trembled. "Because you couldn't not do it. I was certain you, like me, couldn't stop." I lowered my gaze. His words were too precise to ignore. "Nicholas, I can't do this anymore," I said, clenching my hands into fists. "It's wrong. I love Jason." "Then why are you here?" His voice was soft but insistent. I fell silent. Answering was impossible because I didn't know what to say myself. He watched me, his gaze attentive and piercing. "You're afraid to admit what you want," he continued, "but that doesn't mean you don't feel it." "I can't destroy everything Jason and I have," I whispered. "Then destroy yourself," Nicholas replied, leaning closer. "But you're not the same Allison anymore." I felt his hand brush against mine. It was a soft, almost imperceptible gesture, but it made me shudder. Everything I had been trying to suppress surfaced. "Nicholas, stop," I said, but my voice sounded too weak. "Do you want me to stop?" His eyes looked straight into mine, and in the next moment, he leaned toward me, his lips almost touching mine. It was just a second, but it felt like eternity. I felt the world around me fade away. At that moment, someone entered the cafe, and the sound of the door closing brought me back to reality. I quickly pulled back, stood up, and took a step away. "I can't, Nicholas. This has gone too far." He said nothing, but his eyes said it all. I knew this wasn't the end. It all started with a small sound, a notification on my phone. It was an ordinary weekday evening. Jason was sitting on the couch, scrolling through some photos on his laptop, while I was making tea in the kitchen. I had left my phone on the coffee table in the living room, not expecting anything unusual. When I heard his voice calling me, my heart skipped a beat. "Allison, you've got a message. Want me to check it?" I hurried back into the room, trying to look as calm as possible, but when I saw him holding my phone, my fingers instinctively curled into fists. The screen displayed the message. "You were right. We should have stopped this." But it's too late now. It was from Nicholas. Jason looked up, his face a mix of confusion and slight irritation. "What's this?" he asked, handing me the phone. I snatched it from his hand and quickly locked the screen, unsure of how to respond. My mind was a whirlwind of panic. "It's nothing," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "Nothing?" Jason frowned. "Allison, this doesn't look like nothing. It's just a misunderstanding." I forced a smile. but my voice sounded unconvincing. Jason stood up. His expression shifted. He looked more concerned now. Wait, what do you mean we should have stopped this? Stopped what? With whom? I tried to step back, to turn away, but he moved closer. Allison, what's going on? I want to know. Nothing, I repeated, avoiding his eyes. It's just a personal message. It's not important. But Jason wasn't letting it go. His voice grew louder, his tone firmer. You're lying to me. I can see it. You can't even look me in the eye. Who sent you this? It's just a friend, I managed to say. He was silent for a moment, but his eyes were filled with suspicion. It's Nicholas, isn't it? Those words felt like a blow. I felt the blood drain from my face. He couldn't know, but his intuition had struck too close to the truth. Jason, you're misunderstanding, I started, but he cut me off. Then explain it to me. I want the truth. My heart pounded so hard I thought he could hear it. I tried to find the right words, but every one of them felt like a lie. There's nothing going on between us, I finally said, but even I didn't believe it. His gaze turned cold, almost detached. You know, Allison, I thought I knew you, but right now, you're leaving me with no choice. He turned sharply and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there alone, overwhelmed by fear. Meanwhile, Nicholas sat at home, holding his phone. He was rereading his last conversation with Allison. His expression remained calm, but inside, emotions raged. He hadn't planned for things to go this far, but now that they had, he knew there was no turning back. He knew sending that message was a mistake, but the urge to reach out had outweighed his better judgment. Now that it had landed in the wrong hands, he began to question whether it had been worth it. Damn it, he muttered, placing the phone on the table. He realized that Jason would likely suspect something. His brother wasn't a fool, and despite his trusting nature, he had a knack for piecing puzzles together. Nicholas debated whether he should step in and try to smooth things over. But then what? Admit everything? Lie? He paced the room, feeling his usual composure begin to crack. When I approached Jason's door, it was closed. I knocked, but there was no response. I knew I had to say something, but words felt useless. I spent the entire night alone, feeling as though the world around me was starting to collapse. The secret I had tried so hard to keep was on the verge of being exposed. I didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. This game with fire was nearing its end. I sat on the bed, staring at the carpet's intricate pattern, which suddenly seemed endlessly fascinating. The world around me had lost its meaning. The room was utterly silent, but inside me, a storm raged. Jason had left without saying a word. His silence was louder than any shout, and it made everything unbearable. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice. On one side was stability, comfort, and the peace Jason had always brought into my life. On the other was passion, an irresistible pull, and chaos, everything that came with Nicholas. Neither path felt right, but I knew I had to choose. Jason decided to leave for a few days. He said he needed time to think, but I knew he was creating space not just for himself, but for me too. It was his way of giving me a chance to be honest. When Nicholas texted me, I wasn't surprised. His message was brief and resolute. We need to talk. At the pier. Tonight. I knew I should have ignored him, but instead, I got dressed and left the house as though it were inevitable. The pier was as deserted as it had been that night when we first found ourselves there together. The wind blew in from the sea, cold and piercing, but I barely felt it. Nicholas was already waiting, standing at the edge with his hands in his pockets. You came, he said, turning to face me. His voice was quiet, but there was certainty in it. I couldn't not come, I replied, walking closer. We stood in silence, staring at the waves endlessly crashing against the wooden pilings. I felt the tension between us building, as if the sea absorbed it and hurled it back at us. What do you want, Nicholas? I finally asked, breaking the silence. The truth, he said, looking straight into my eyes. You need to decide what you want. It's not that simple. You're the one making it complicated, Allison, he said, stepping closer. I know what you feel, and I know it won't just go away. You're too sure of yourself, I tried to counter, but my voice lacked conviction. And you're too afraid. His words hit their mark. I averted my gaze, feeling the turmoil inside me intensify. He said nothing more, but his gaze spoke volumes. We stood inches apart, and I knew that in this moment, everything was being decided. The pier stood as a silent witness to our meeting. His eyes met mine, and in that intersection, there were more questions than answers. Time seemed to stop. This was how the story ended. Me standing at the crossroads of my own life, feeling as though every path led to chaos. The choice was mine, but I hadn't made it yet. And perhaps this was the only moment I truly felt alive.